Will new anti-fraud measures stop online scammers getting hold of your money?
And how might Satellite SOS save your life?
Hi there. Welcome back to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the award-winning tech podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading tech journalists and commentators to dive into the big tech stories of the week. I'm Alex Kidman, and usually I only see this man virtually via the Vertical Hold studios, but last week I was in the actual physical presence of Mr. Adam Turner at the annual IT Journo Awards. Hey Adam, I had to leave early, and that is actually true. I did have to leave early. Did we win anything?
Nah, we lost out to some little podcast called Download This Show. Although I reckon that Mark Fennell guy's got a promising future.
Yeah, look, it's nice to see these youngsters do well. And hey, I was on Download last year,
Yeah, I've
so
been on
I
a couple
might
of
just nip
times.
off and, shave off 1/52nd
Yeah.
of that Lizzie for my own purposes. I figure I've earned it. But, well, look, also for what it's worth, between us, Adam and I do already have quite the stocked award cabinet.
And the drinks cabinet.
Well, that's true too. But this week we are joined by a man who did win at the awards. Joining us from Finder, it is, and this is official, the best dressed man in IT journalism, Angus Kidman.
Thanks for having me again, gentlemen. Yes, I am the best dressed man in IT journalism. I know that Adidas are looking for a new design partner right now, so can I just say I'm available?
And as his manager, I'll be taking 10% of that. But while we wait for that email to come through, surely just a matter of time, Gus is joining us to talk through the new systems being put in place by Australian banks that promise to make it harder for criminals to get hold of grandma's cash stacks. Well, at least in theory. We're also going to take a deep dive into Satellite SOS now that it's live for Australian iPhone users. But first, it's time for me to take a quick trip to the Vertical Hold Rapid Fire News Desk. Let's take a look at what's been happening this week. And first up, actually, we're going to stick with Apple, funnily enough. Apple's launched Tap to Pay on iPhone for merchants. Gus, what's Tap to Pay? Don't I already do that with my iPhone if I've got one?
So, tap to pay is being able to use your iPhone as something to accept payments. So, let's imagine you go onto the Sunday markets, you want to buy some jam, and you don't want to pay with cash. Previously, if you've done that, someone will have had a specialized device, a Square or something little like that maybe you could tap. Now they can just use their own iPhone. And actually, to set that up, they set up an account with one of a range of partner banks, and they can just take payments through that. So it's using that iPhone as a payment receipt device, not as the device that you're making the payment with.
And I imagine that Apple wants a taste of the gig.
Apple does want a taste of the gig. We don't know what that is because you don't have that partnership with Apple. You have it with the bank. So the bank is going to charge you a rate. The two banks that have announced it so far, they're going to charge you 1.4% of the transaction. Apple is going to be getting a cut of that, and we don't know what cut, but it's going to be getting that cut basically because you're using its phone. So it's a lovely form of passive income, even if they're only taking 0.2%.
So not like 30% like they like to take from some things.
No, they haven't really leaned into that developer level space, but clipping the ticket is a great business model. Apple's always liked doing it, and this is a good thing to do. This has been available in the States since about this time last year, so it just took a while for them to do a deal with Australian banks, which, as we'll be discussing a bit further on the episode, is not that surprising.
So if only two banks are offering it, I can't see too many businesses, small to medium sized, particularly thinking, well, my bank doesn't. I think I'll jump banks just to get this particular functionality. I mean, I would have thought you'd spend more money, you'd incur more costs doing that than you might saying, right, I will jump to one of the two that have announced this.
So another half dozen banks have said they're going to get on board. So it will be interesting to see people take it up. But I think for that really small micro business owner who owns an iPhone, this is where this is appealing. Because at the moment, if you're going to do this, you would use something like Square is the biggest competitor. Tyro and a few others have similar devices that do that. And what we find with them is that actually sometimes their actual percentage rates are higher because that's how they pay for their stuff. So I think with Square, it starts at 1.6, maybe goes to 2.2. Sometimes it's a thing where you pay a flat 30 cents and then a percentage of the transaction. It's like most of these things, comparing them is really difficult. But I do think there is going to be a market space here that if you are that person who is running a very small business and you already have an iPhone, this genuinely could be one of the cheaper ways to have something as a side hustle business. I think once you want real business banking, you're looking at a different story.
I think where they might struggle is what kind of software and tools they offer behind the scenes. Because in theory, anybody can give you that ability to take someone's money. Square will give you the little physical reader, but they also give you the software in the background. It doesn't matter how small a business you are. You can keep track of your inventory. You can keep track of where that money's coming in and out. Because we all know, as being freelancers, sometimes people pay you money and they just go, "Here's a ton of money," and you've got to figure out what it's for and where it came from. It's those tools on the background, and so
Does money just sometimes randomly turn up in your bank account, Adam? I wish I
it
had
does.
these
Yeah,
problems.
but the problem is them figuring it, like, here's money and it doesn't add up to any of the invoices that I've sent these people, and I've got to figure it all out. So that is one of the things with Square, is it makes it easier to actually manage a business as well. So if Apple's not offering any of those kinds of tools, then it's only your really small micro businesses, because you'll get to a certain point where just having the money put in your bank account's not enough. You need those tools to actually track what's going on.
Well, again, those tools will come from the providers. So one of the two that's live now is Tyro. They
Okay.
do have those kind of tools. So
Yeah.
honestly, it's maybe Apple being a little bit sensitive about it and going, well, if they brought in their own platform and said you must, because if Apple had a platform, that would be all you'd be allowed to use,
Yeah.
and then they might get slapped for competition concerns. So yeah, the way that you choose one of these ones, so far of the two banks that have done it, the rates are the same. And as a business, what you do is you look at it and you say, okay, what other support services have you done? Are you providing me with reporting? Will you export straight away into whatever accounting system I'm using?
Yeah.
Those are the things that are going to make the difference.
Exactly.
Well, speaking of making a difference, there's a different new social media network on the block, Boa. And its point of differentiation is meant to be that it's for professional and business users. Gus, don't we already have a thing called LinkedIn?
We do have a thing called LinkedIn, which is supposed to be where you can interact with other businesses. And of course, what that really means is that everyone goes on there and says, aren't I great? Love me, love me. Please give me a high five. Please hire me. That's what LinkedIn is. And Boa feels like it will be more of the same. It says its distinguishing features are that it's going to be Australian only and that it's going to have communities of interest so that you can discuss things in specific ways. Honestly, I think if there's one thing we know, it's that, trying to launch social platforms that a single country is just going to get you into trouble. Like, platform building is a global thing. So I think good luck to them, burn some money on this, but I'll be amazed if it's here in 12 months.
Yeah, I mean, especially for business, why do you want to limit your business to just Australia? It doesn't feel like it makes an awful lot of sense. Moving right along, Google is back in the headlines, and if you've got an older Google account, one you sort of set up a few years ago, but you don't really use for anything, or you set it up on a whim, you might not have that account very much longer. Gus, what's the story here?
Well, Google has just announced that it's going to be enforcing a policy where any Google account that hasn't been accessed for 2 years, it's going to close down. So if an account hasn't been active in 2 years, they're saying, right, that's long enough already. We're going to get rid of this one. It'll send a few messages to that account before it shuts it down to say, hey, you might want to be aware of this. But yeah, if you haven't had any form of activity, it's going to say, no, go away. Lots of people talking about this. I think realistically, if you've got a Google account, you either are using it fairly regularly or you've forgotten about it and it doesn't matter. I just don't know that many people are going to be affected by it. I don't know what Adam's going to do with his fake Adam Turner account. I don't know whether he signed into that for a while. But
That's what I was actually just thinking about, because I was thinking, oh, this doesn't really apply to me. And then I realized I've probably got about a dozen Gmail accounts that I've created for different bits and pieces. How many of them I still rely on because they forward something from A to B? I don't know. I'm actually going to have to sit down and go through it. But as you say, for most people, they've got one or two. And if it hasn't been used for a couple of years, one of the things I was saying is it's these really old accounts are the ones that tend to be the least secure. They have really weak passwords. They don't use two-factor authentication. So actually leaving them running is also putting the people around them at risk.
absolutely. And Google is starting, it said, with accounts that got set up and literally never did a single thing again. So we know people set
Yeah.
up burner accounts. And you can
Yeah.
see that's quite a good metric. It's like if you set up this account and never done a darn thing, then I say to Google, get out that flamethrower, fair enough.
I wonder how they're defining activity. I mean, you're right. Yeah, burner accounts, fine, burn them. But I wonder how they're defining activity, and specifically around things like YouTube. Because
YouTube is activity. YouTube is activity.
but
Counts.
is YouTube activity where someone's watched one of your videos activity? Because what I'm thinking here, there are some accounts, there are some things that I follow or have subscribed to that haven't necessarily uploaded a video for years, but the content's still there and it's quite good content. But under this, if they haven't done something with it in 2 years, is it all suddenly going to vanish off YouTube? I wonder.
The suggestion seems to be in the blog announcement that they have kind of called out that they don't see big activity happening in the YouTube space at this time. So if the sole purpose of that Google account, because again, Google
Hmm.
accounts cover all these things, was YouTube, it doesn't look like that will be the first things to disappear. But ultimately, I think if there was an account where literally nothing happened, you would hope that if you'd run those things, even if you weren't uploading, if you just get a message saying, "Hey, can you log in once?" Because that's all it is. You just
Hmm.
log into your Google account, do a search, log out again. That will count as activity, so you don't have to upload anything. You could just you could just log into your Gmail, have a look at it, and go away. It's not a high barrier to get over.
Listeners, log in and search on how to subscribe to the Vertical Hold podcast today. Although, if you're listening to this, I'm not sure how you
Yeah,
haven't already.
subscribe from a dozen burner accounts. That'll really help the
That's
numbers.
a great, if slightly illicit, idea. Getting on to more legitimate businesses, or in fact, businesses that aren't legitimate businesses anymore. Oppo's announced that it's shutting down its chip subsidiary. So it had started to make its own co-processors largely for its phones. We'd only seen a handful of them here in Australia, and now we won't see any more. Gus, is this in any way surprising?
Honestly, when I saw this headline about Oppo drops chips, I thought, what, they'd come out into snack food and I didn't know about it. No, it's not. Chip fabs are fantastically expensive things to run. They require huge capital investment. They require loads of research. And even the people who are really good at this, like Intel, have kind of struggled to sort of go along as consistently as they have in recent years. So it doesn't surprise me at all. I think the future for Oppo or anyone like that has always been in, okay, let's get stuff that someone else has built and just put it together slightly more cleverly and slightly more cheaply.
And finally, Gus, I know you're a man who loves to get on a plane. You've been on far more planes this decade than I have, because in fact, this decade I am yet to set foot on a plane, oddly enough, for some reason. Uh,
Ooh.
but in fact, one of the last times I did, my bags went missing. And that happens to people from time to time. And one of the things that we've seen the rise of in recent years is people using things like Apple's AirTags to work out where their bags are. And some airlines don't seem too happy about that. This week, Air New Zealand, though, has announced it's going to be offering app based bag tracking to consumers. Give us the lowdown on this.
This sounds cool. It's not quite as cool as you think it is, unfortunately. What it means is if you've got the Air New Zealand app once you've checked in, you will be able to, on some flights, have a look and see where in the system Air New Zealand says your bag is. So rather than just having to rely on waiting to go to the counter to find that out, it will say, oh, this is checked in, this is in transit within this airport, this is on this plane. Like you'll be able to see the same status information that it could see. And that's kind of useful if they know what's going on. But one of the things we learned during the pandemic in some of those big airline breakdowns when things started coming back was that sometimes the airlines didn't know that. And if the airline doesn't know, it's not going to show up in this app. And in that case, you might have still been better off with an AirTag. Virgin Australia has actually announced intention to have a similar trial. So this is the way people are going. And it's an obvious feature. If they've got that in there and they know who you are, why not say, well, this is what we can see about your bag? But long-standing experience, I've stood in US airports where they've said, oh, no, your bag's still in LA. And then I've walked over and it's actually sitting on a carousel. So, your mileage may vary, as they like to say in these flying circumstances.
Enjoying the show? That's great. Don't forget to subscribe, which you can do on every podcast platform you've ever heard of. Just search for Vertical Hold or go to our website, verticalhold.com.au, where we've got handy buttons for every single podcast platform. So, we've talked a bit on this show recently, quite recently, in fact, about scams and the impact that they have on Australians. And a lot of people have had, not unreasonably, complaints to make against the banks and their role in this. And this week, the banks have announced a new system which they say is designed to limit the scope of scams, the Fraud Reporting Exchange, or FRX. Gus, FRX sounds terrible. What is it?
Yeah, I was really disappointed that it wasn't a sequel to that excellent Brian Brown movie, FX, about a special effects artist, how that worked. But it's much less exciting than that. So the Fraud Reporting Exchange has been announced by the Australian Banking Association. And basically the idea is that it's going to make it much quicker for banks to exchange information around when a fraud is happening. So if there's a live fraud out there, someone is actively contacting people, they're exchanging the details of, okay, this is the account the payments are going to, this is what's happening. So they've got a chance to block that more effectively in closer to real time. And, at a motherhood level, very hard to argue with any of that. Sounds really sensible. We want banks to be doing everything they can to try and stop these frauds as soon as possible. So it sounds very worthy, but once you dig into it, I think you realize that, okay, to some extent, this is the banks trying to get ahead of the regulators coming in and saying, hey, we're going to force you to do this stuff because we know that banks have a really poor track record on actually dealing with fraud. And this was highlighted in a recent ASIC report that pointed out just how bad the banks were at actually dealing with this. I think, in a good situation, 5% is like the maximum number of people who will ever see money back after they've been scammed, which is like an appallingly low percentage, let's be honest, when things are automated and should be able to be tracked. So it's a good first step, but it's not really live yet. They've said there are 17 banks joining or in the process of joining. So we don't know what that means in terms of when things go live. And I think there'll be more work to be done for this actually to make a difference to scam levels.
So in theory, there's been nothing stopping them doing this for years, right?
Well, they like to make money, Adam. That's what
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. It's not some magical new technology. Something's changed. It's just there's enough pressure on them finally to go, oh, we better look like we're doing something about it.
Yes, I think it very much is this kind of thing. Is you're kind of saying, okay, the banks are not responsible for the scams, but they are the mechanism that's in place here. And a lot of evidence has emerged from ASIC and from consumer regulators that even when people report these things, and even when they report them very promptly, the chances of them turning around the transactions are really, really depressingly low.
It strikes me that this is the really weak link in the chain here as well, in that it's still incumbent upon the consumer to realize, hang on, I have been scammed and now I must do something. We're not talking about a system here where the banks are going, this transaction looks scammy, it looks odd, let's talk to the other bank, let's work out what's going on, which theoretically I suppose you could do, although there are some privacy concerns there too. This is still, I've still got to phone up my bank and go, oh no, I have been scammed. Please help me get my money back.
I
Yeah, well,
assumed
I
it
mean,
was the first thing. I assumed it was them being proactive, like how you get
No.
well, no,
intelligence
Well,
on
not as I read it. I could be wrong.
spyware and stuff. They go, oh,
no.
we've
So
seen this new thing pop up. You should all watch out for it.
in
No?
we will have to see how it operates because yes, in theory, what should happen is if they've been able to report that hey, this particular account at wherever, like whether it's in one of those member banks, this particular account has been associated with a fraudulent thing. What you would like the outcome to be is that that's one of those ones that it's frozen. They don't automatically let anybody else transfer money into that account. This is where you want to get to with this, and it seems to me that like there has to be a willingness by the banks to take on some responsibility here. I mean, it is odd. We're all aware if you make a payment yourself to somebody for the first time, it won't go through for 24 hours. That's a pretty standard feature of any payment platform in Australia now, that if you're setting up transfers to someone else, the first one takes a while. So if you get scammed that way and reported immediately, it shocks me that those ones can't be blocked because those funds shouldn't have been cleared immediately under the bank policies. And yet we have evidence that in some cases, that's not what happens, that even if you work it out immediately and contact the bank, sometimes they go, oops, oh, sorry, too late. And I think that shows that they're not entirely delivering on what they should be doing on this front anyway. So we really do have to see how they operate this before we decide whether it's good or bad. But the lack of detail, the lack of willingness to talk about it makes me suspicious. And the other thing that makes me suspicious, I was interested in this, so I went and read through the very thin site that has been set up to talk about FRX. And I was reading through their privacy policy, and understandably, this organization is sometimes going to have access to quite confidential details about people because they'll need to know what transactions are going on in order to be detecting them. I can understand that. And they have a privacy policy that says that you're entitled to ask us what information you hold about us. Again, fair enough. But then they say, oh, but if we do, they say we may refuse your request, which is pretty scandalous to start with. And if we do provide it, we may charge you a fee. And I'm like, hang on a minute. Like, I can understand why sometimes when something like a freedom of information request goes from a journalist, if that's really complicated, there might be a cost. But for an organization funded by banks that are reporting record profits year after year, the notion that if I say to you, hang on, I want to know what information you've got about me, I'm going to charge you a fee for that, I think that's appalling. And they want to deal with that one if they want to remotely be seen as having an interest in the consumer rather than just trying to protect themselves.
Am I right in thinking also part of the problem here is that the way the banks talk to each other and the way technology has changed means you can move money around a lot more quickly than you used to be able to. I mean, I just get shocked now. I send customers invoices and I get paid money the same day, and I nearly fell off my chair the first time that happened because this was the thing that used to take a long time, but you can now actually transfer money around very quickly, can't you?
You can, and if you transfer it into something like crypto, then the ability to even say, hey, I want to do a recall can be really complex. And we love that convenience. This is part of the
Mm.
thing. We like that idea. And what some of the people who monitor this space say is, look, actually, we need to make things a bit slower because the level of fraud is so high. We need to put up with not getting paid for 6 hours to have a reasonably better chance of detecting these things. And that makes sense to me. I could endorse that. I could live with that change if it meant we didn't go through there. I think it's estimated $13 billion of scams in Australia each year, and that's probably on the low side because, as usual, not all of them get reported. So those balancing acts, I think, are going to be really tricky for banks and financial institutions to sort out.
So, Alex, one of the challenges of living in a wide brown land is every now and then you find yourself stuck in the middle of nowhere with a problem and no way to reach anybody.
But
What's
enough about your place, Adam.
Yeah, but enough about my place. What's what's Apple doing to help people in those kind of situations?
So this week, Apple announced the availability of what they call Satellite SOS. So this is using global satellites and any of the iPhone 14 generation, so only their newest iPhones, to send out SOS messages, whether your car breaks down or you break your leg or you're lost or there's a fire or a flood or any of a variety of emergencies where typically you'd call 000 in those situations where you can't call 000. And they actually took me out to not quite the back of Beyond. In fact, it was just a kind of simulated back of Beyond because I should point out that making false emergency calls is a criminal offense. Don't do it. But they took me out to demonstrate this last week. I've actually got a video which I will throw up on the Vertical Hold site for people to look at to run through how this works. It's quite an interesting system. You basically have to try and dial 000 first to see if you can get a signal. And it's important to point this out actually, because this is one of those things that a lot of people don't know. Actually, getting to places that have zero signal is not impossible in Australia. I'm sure there'll be a few listeners who'll be going, oh, yeah, just out the back of my place. But getting to somewhere that has no signal from any provider is harder. And that's because for 000, it doesn't have to be your network. You can be a Vodafone customer. And if you're in trouble and there's a Telstra signal somewhere, you can latch onto that and make that emergency call. They all share this around because it's good business. I'm not
I would
entirely
assume
sure
it's
if
the
they're
law.
they may be
Yeah.
legislatively obliged to. It would not surprise me in the least. I just haven't looked that up because I'm not a lawyer. But you can do that regardless. But if you are in one of those situations, again, across this wide brown land, there's nothing. You point your iPhone at the sky, you dial 000, it tries to make the call, it fails, it then says, right, you can now do satellite via SOS.
I
Or
reckon
satellite
that
SOS, I should say.
I reckon there is a legal requirement because I do remember when um, mobs like Skype started offering calling in Australia. There was a problem where you couldn't necessarily call 000, and I think that meant they had regulatory issues. Is this ringing a bell?
That is what happened with Skype, and for a while there, until they worked out how to do it, they had to put up really clear disclaimers that said you cannot use this service, particularly
Yeah.
if you signed up for their paid calling service. Skype will say to you, look, you cannot make emergency calls with this, and you need to be aware of that. And that was how they went around the ring. And it goes right back to, like, you've always been able to make free 000 calls from a payphone. Of course, now you can make free calls everywhere from a payphone, but different topic. So yes, there's always been that regulatory requirement. And to be fair, and I think, all the providers have done what they can to make that happen. They've always enabled that across their services. But there's still going to be that back of Burke moment where you might find none of these work, and then so suddenly then you're having your Priscilla moment, holding your iPhone up to the sky and just going, okay, let's hopefully get hold of someone, or at the very least transmit enough information so that data goes through. Because I think there's a few different things that get sent out there, Alex, in terms of the information it conveys.
Yeah, so what happens is you get this little questionnaire. It basically says, what's the nature of your emergency? Is it just you or is it other people? Are people hurt? And obviously, depending on what you say, the questions vary a little bit as well. And that gets transmitted, and then you then start essentially a very slow SMS based conversation with a responder who will forward that on to the relevant nearby authorities based on your GPS location. Because obviously, there's no point in having a responder in Melbourne if you are, in fact, in the middle of Western Australia or something like that, just middle of, absolute no coverage zone whatsoever. In fact, you may be in serious trouble then, but then they can cater to those needs and to that location. What you could also do with this, and it's kind of interesting, is you set up, if you've set them up already, you have to do this in advance. You can have that information also sent to emergency contacts. So other people who may be concerned about you can also get told, hey, this has happened. And obviously, for example, farmers on some of those really big remote farms might find that quite useful because obviously if someone at the farmhouse sees that, they might be closer than any emergency service could be.
So whose satellites are they using?
So it's a company called Global Star. They've got a 24 satellite constellation that circles around. Now, one of the limitations of that, and this is just a limitation of the way satellites work, basically, is that you may have a gap of up to a minute in between seeing a satellite. The phone itself, it's quite a cute little system, and if you do have an iPhone 14, you can run a demo version of it. It doesn't send any live data. You don't break the law doing it. Please don't try and simulate it because, again, it's criminal offence and you're wasting valuable resources. It's not a joke. But it shows you a little animated thing to say, right, the next satellite is going to be in this direction, so point your phone this way, and then it'll light up green and say, right, it's there. But you may have to wait a minute or two, and of course, you've got to do that questionnaire. So if you feel like you are starting to get in trouble, that's the time to start making the call. Not so much when the wild bunyip is actually chewing on your leg already.
This makes sense. This makes sense. Um, I mean, it's an interesting example where obviously the reason Apple can do this is because they control both the software platform and the hardware platform. It's understandable, but still a bit disappointing that it is literally only the newest models that have it, because I don't know how many people are going to be driving around the back of it. And again, we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, but it'd be nice if they can at some point advance this to have some of those features in earlier models. But I'm guessing that just might be challenging in terms of what's actually baked inside the phone.
It's that, yeah, yeah. It's 100%. It's the hardware. It's not actually, for once. It's not them saying no. This feature is only for these devices. It is, to everyone's understanding, the hardware that's the limitation there, and it's not going to be exclusive to iPhone for all that long, perhaps. So earlier this year, Qualcomm actually announced its effective version of this within its Snapdragon chips, but again, that is going to be in your premium flagship phones, and I don't believe any have shipped just yet with that feature baked in. And you've also, obviously, you've still got to do all your regulatory deals and all your setups for this. We should also mention, actually, it's not just Australia, it's also New Zealand that's just gone live with this as well. So for any of our New Zealand listeners, if you get stuck down a ravine and can still see the sky, then maybe you can get yourself out of trouble.
So some people would say, "Oh, but my old phone's got GPS; it can see satellites. It should be able to do this." But am I right in thinking that when your phone is using GPS, it's listening to the satellites, but not talking back to the satellites? And the difference with this is it's actually talking back to the satellites.
That's it exactly.
Yeah.
It's acting as a satellite phone. And I mean, satellite phones themselves are nothing new. It's just that if you wanted to have a satellite phone in Australia, typically you were involved in mining, basically, because satellite phone tech and satellite phone access has always been horrifically expensive. I mean, just beyond the dreams of mortal man kind of expensive just to send a single message. This is baking this into a smartphone for worst case scenarios only. Also interesting, based on our previous conversation around Apple and taking a slice of things, this is actually going to be free for at least 2 years.
After which they charge you money to save your life.
Yeah.
After which they get very cagey, I found,
Mhm.
when you ask them questions about what happens after which.
Yeah.
Honestly, to give them benefit of the doubt, I don't think they know themselves. I suspect it will come down to a question of usage and costs, and whether or not, I suspect, again, I don't know, Tim Cook doesn't answer my emails, whether or not they figure they're selling more phones than it's costing them to run the service, that kind of thing. Because again, it's not exactly something that I think they're going to be seeing, millions of phone calls from. They've released a couple of case studies from the States, because it's been live in the States since November last year, also live in parts of Europe. A couple of case studies from the US where they've shown, yeah, look, this has helped save lives. That's great. But it's, 300 million people in the US and a fair percentage of people are owning iPhones. It's not getting used a whole bunch. And maybe that'll keep the costs low enough that after 2 years, they just go, yeah, look, as long as you've got an iPhone, you can use this and help save your life.
Yeah.
And you
And
can be
Richard,
sure they'll put out a big press release the first time it does save somebody, and that'll make it worth it for them.
mm,
Well, it'll make it worth it for the person whose life is saved.
you'd have to think so. And returning to your earlier point, Adam, I would not be surprised as this becomes more common as a model, and once we see those Qualcomm chips come out and there's more Android phones, I could see this being baked into the ongoing requirements that are in the regulation. So just as they've said, you've got to be able to do this, I can imagine they'll say, right, yeah, providers have to make a reasonable attempt to make these services accessible. So I can imagine that in 5 years' time, when you're doing the special vertical hold back a bush addition, I can look forward to getting that message from Alex as one of his emergency contacts saying, "Help, I'm stuck in Galaganbone and Adam's got a knife."
Well, that just about wraps up this week's episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Gus for joining us again.
Pleasure as always.
And now it's time, as it usually is, and as you've heard me say, because I think you've done this more than anyone else, for you to face the Vertical Hold 3 questions of doom. You know the drill. All 3 questions I'll ask at once. You can answer them in any order, but pretty much everyone answers them in the same order. But let me finish first. Where can people find your work online? Where can they find you on social media? And based on our discussion earlier about your joy of travel, where's the one place on the planet you haven't been to yet that you still want to?
Okay, so people can find my mainstream journalistic work or my articles about finance and tech and things like that at finder.com.au, and you can find my weird rants about Star Wars and Aldi and stuff on my personal site, anguskidman.show. You can find me still on Twitter at the moment, at least this week, at GusWorldAU. And in terms of places that I really want to go, like there's still lots of places on my list. I'm going to go with one that feels obvious, and I can't believe I haven't been there. I'll stick stateside. I've never been to Chicago. It's the one really big US city I haven't been to, and everyone says it's spectacular and amazing, so I'll put Chicago near the top of the list for now.
Interesting choice. Interesting choice. And as always, you can catch us online at Vertical Hold AU on Twitter, on Instagram, via the Vertical Hold Facebook page, or on the web at verticalhold.com.au.
Thanks everyone for tuning in again. And if you're out the back of Burke, drop us a line. Let us know what you think about the Satellite SOS service and all the other stuff we talked about this week.
Is there anybody in the front of Burke? Like, do we ever think about that?